Welcome to John Carter Stories, the red light above, operating room 3 pulsed like a dying heart, and I was running toward it. My wet shoes screamed against the sterile floor. Rain from the storm outside still clung to my coat, dripping onto the linoleum in small, cold pools as I skidded toward those double doors. I could see the silhouette of the surgeon through the frosted glass, and my chest felt like something inside it was being slowly crushed. My son was in there, my only boy, my entire reason for still getting up in the morning, supposedly broken and bleeding on a table, while I stood helpless on the other side of that steel door. I reached for the handle. My fingers were trembling so badly I could barely grip it, and then a hand locked around my forearm like a vice. I was yanked backward with such force that my heels actually left the floor, pulled into a dark supply alcove tucked between heavy linen carts. A woman in forest green scrubs appeared from the shadows. Her eyes were wide and darting and absolutely terrified. She pressed her palm over my mouth before I could make a sound. "Don't make a noise if you want to live," she hissed into my ear. Ah, those words. In that moment, standing in that dark alcove with a stranger's hand over my mouth and my son, supposedly dying 10 feet away, those 7 words were the most confusing and the most important thing anyone had ever said to me. Please subscribe and like this video, and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Edmund Harlow. I am 68 years old, retired aerospace engineer, a man who spent 4 decades calculating tolerances down to thousandth of an inch, a man who prided himself on seeing structural failure before the bridge collapsed. And I had completely missed the collapse happening inside my own family. Let me take you back to the beginning, because what happened that night didn't start in a hospital. It started 6 weeks earlier in my living room, with a stack of insurance papers and a son who smiled like everything was fine. My son's name is Callum, 37 years old, charming in a way that only truly dangerous people are charming. He had been struggling financially for months, or at least that was the story he had been telling me. A failed property development, debt mounting, the usual pressures of a man who had always lived larger than his income could support. I had bailed him out before, more times than I should have, but he was my blood. He was the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car journeys, the boy his mother had pressed my hand and whispered about in her final days. Take care of him, Edmund. He is all we have left. 3 years of silence since Eleanor's funeral. 3 years of filling the apartment with loyalty to a son I believed was just a man drowning in bad luck, needing a father to pull him back to the surface. Oh, if I had only known what he was actually drowning in. 5 weeks before the night at the hospital, Callum sat in my worn leather armchair and spread paperwork across the coffee table with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed this moment carefully. He told me it was a Guardian life insurance policy. He told me it was just for our collective security. He told me the premiums were nothing, just a formality, just peace of mind for 2 men who only had each other. I told him I was on a fixed income, that the premiums were steep for a retired man. He smiled that smooth, patient smile. "Why are you making this so difficult, Dad? It is just a signature." He had even insisted on an accidental death clause, what he called a double indemnity rider, framing it as a standard feature for men my age. Nothing to worry about, just common sense. I signed, because when it is your own blood sitting across the table from you, you do not look for the poison in the cup. You assume the hand reaching toward yours is there to steady you, not to push you into the dark. The policy was for $5.2 million, and Callum was the sole beneficiary. I did not know that yet. I found out in a hospital alcove with a stranger's hand over my mouth. Now let me take you back to the evening it all began, 3 hours before I ended up running down that corridor. I was sitting in my apartment in the armchair where Callum had placed those insurance papers. The evening news was on. I had a cup of coffee that had gone cold on the side table. The ordinary quiet of a retired man's Tuesday evening. The landline rang. It was a woman's voice. Precise, clinical, urgent. She identified herself as a doctor calling from St. Margaret's Medical Center. She told me my son had been involved in a catastrophic collision on the motorway. Spinal injuries. Emergency surgery. Come immediately. Is he alive? I managed. My voice cracked on those two words like something dry breaking apart. She didn't waver. She fed me details with the rhythm of a script. Words like critical and catastrophic and immediate, each one a bullet aimed at the softest part of me. I fumbled for my coat. I dropped my keys twice. I looked at the framed photograph of Callum on the side table, his gap-toothed childhood smile staring back at me, and I whispered to him through the empty apartment, "I am coming. Just hold on." As I grabbed the keys from the floor and made for the door, something made me pause. The floor safe in the corner of the room. The door was slightly ajar, just a sliver of darkness where it should have been flush and sealed. I didn't have time to wonder about it. My son was dying. I slammed the apartment door behind me and ran straight into the arms of a plan that had been carefully assembled over months by the only person on earth I had never thought to protect myself from. In the car on the way to the hospital, I called Callum's fiancée. Her name is Serena Voss, 34 years old, marketing executive, the kind of woman whose eyes always seem to be calculating the distance to the nearest exit. The phone rang 5 times before she answered, her voice foggy and slow. "Serena, it is Edmund. There's been an accident. Callum is at St. Margaret's." There was a pause, a beat too long, a silence too polished. Oh my goodness," she said, her voice rising in a way that felt, even then, like something being turned up rather than something genuine. "St. Margaret's. I will be there as soon as I can. I am sure Dr. Voss is doing everything he can." My breath caught in my throat. I had not mentioned the doctor. I had not mentioned surgery. I had not told her anything except the hospital name. She hung up before I could ask how she knew the surgeon's name. And the quiet inside the car after that was louder than the storm outside. Something was wrong. The engineer in me, the part trained to detect stress fractures before the failure, was screaming now. But the father in me pressed the accelerator harder. I was almost at the hospital, and by the time I understood what was waiting for me there, I was already inside. I need you to stay with me here, because I know this is a lot, but this is only the very beginning. That phone call, that pause beat, that name she should not have known, that was the first crack in the surface. Drop a comment right now and tell me, did you see it coming? And stay right here, because what happens inside that hospital is something I will never fully recover from seeing. St. Margaret's Medical Center rose out of the storm like a concrete cliff face, its upper floors swallowed by low cloud. I abandoned my car in the emergency lane and pushed through the sliding glass doors into the lobby. And immediately, something felt wrong. There was no triage, no waiting families. No distant sound of urgency that belongs to a working emergency department at 11 o'clock on a wet Tuesday night. Instead, vast stretches of the lobby were cordoned off with opaque plastic sheeting that rustled in the climate control draft. Yellow caution tape, signs reading under renovation on every other pillar. A single security guard sat behind the desk. He was wearing heavy tactical boots that belonged on a riot line, not a hospital floor. He looked up slowly. "My son," I said. "Callum Harlow. He was brought in from a motorway collision." The guard adjusted a logbook without urgency. "Renovation tonight, sir. Everything is being routed through the east wing. Service elevators at the end of the hall." I didn't wait. I ran. The 5th floor was wrong in every measurable way. The lights didn't illuminate. They buzzed and flickered with an uneven, nauseating rhythm that set my teeth on edge. The air didn't smell of antiseptic. It smelled of industrial-strength bleach, thick and cloying, the kind of smell designed to erase rather than clean. The ICU nursing station was abandoned. A half-eaten sandwich sat on a paper plate next to a glowing monitor, the only sign that anyone had recently been present. I leaned over the counter and looked at the patient log. The entry for Callum Harlow was written in ink, so fresh it was still glistening under the fluorescent light. The entries above and below, they were bone dry and dated nearly 2 weeks ago. Someone had written his name there minutes before I arrived. My stomach turned over slowly, like something heavy shifting underwater. I found the observation window of room 512 and pressed my face to the cold glass, and my heart stopped. There was no dying man on life support, no ventilators, No tubes. No smell of impending death. Callum was sitting upright in a high-back chair, fully dressed in his charcoal suit jacket, looking more alive and relaxed than I had seen him in years. He was leaning back with the effortless posture of a man enjoying the end of a successful evening, a thick cigar in one hand, a glass of amber liquid in the other. Beside him was Dr. Marcus Voss, who I now knew was a surgeon Serena should not have been able to name, and Serena herself, her designer bag on the table in front of her, her face bright with the specific satisfaction of someone who believes a plan is going perfectly. They were laughing, weeping. I want you to understand what it feels like to press your face to a window and watch your son laugh while you believe he is dying, while your heart is still hammering from the sprint through the rain, while your hands are still shaking from dropping your keys on the floor of your apartment. Callum threw his head back, his teeth catching the warm yellow light of the room. I can hardly believe he actually came, he said, his voice muffled but audible through the glass. The old man's heart is softer than his head. Dr. Voss reached into a leather folder and produced the Guardian Life policy, the very document I had signed at my own kitchen table 5 weeks earlier. He pointed to the double indemnity clause. Serena reached into her bag and withdrew a slender, gleaming syringe, handing it to Voss with a smile that never once reached her eyes. Callum lifted his glass, and I watched my son make a toast over the price of my life. That was the moment the hand locked around my forearm. She dragged me backward from the window, pulling me into a staff break room down the corridor with a strength that surprised me completely. The deadbolt clicked shut behind us. I collapsed into a plastic chair, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Her name was Nurse Danny Marsh, 29 years old, ICU nurse, and she had been waiting for this specific night for 12 years. She didn't offer comfort. She slid a cup of stale black coffee across the table and told me to drink it. You need the caffeine, she said, for what comes next. I looked at her. Why are you risking everything for a stranger? She reached into her pocket and placed a worn, laminated obituary on the table between us. This is my father, she said. Her eyes darkened in a way I recognized immediately. The specific darkening of someone who's been carrying something heavy for so long they've forgotten what lightness feels like. He died on Voss's operating table 4 years ago, under the exact same suspicious circumstances they have been planning for you tonight. I looked at the obituary, then back at her. Dr. Voss doesn't just operate on people, she said quietly. He erases them, for a fee. I have spent 4 years documenting the cases, the anesthesia reactions, the sudden hemorrhages, the convenient cardiac events. But I have never had a living witness before tonight. Mr. Harlow, you are the first piece of evidence that can actually walk and talk. She reached into her clipboard and placed a document on the table that made my blood stop entirely. It was a pre-surgical consent form with my name printed at the top, and at the bottom, a perfect forgery of my signature, dated for the following morning. They had already prepared the paperwork for my death. I looked at the forged signature for a long time. The loop of the H was slightly too wide. An aerospace engineer spending decades checking precision tolerances was the only kind of man who would notice that. And I noticed something else. That was not just a forged signature. That was a structural failure. And structural failures always leave evidence. If you know where to look. Weeping, the forged signature, the cigar, the toast. I need you to sit with that for a second because I had to. Comment below and tell me what you are feeling right now. What would you have done standing in that break room? And stay right here because what we find on that computer upstairs, it changes absolutely everything. Danny led me through the maintenance corridor to a ventilation shaft in the ceiling of a utility room 2 floors up. We climbed in silence. My joints protested every rung of the service ladder. The metal beneath my palms was ice cold and tasted of dust. I shimmied forward through the narrow tunnel until I reached a great position directly above room 512 and looked down through the slats at the men planning my funeral. Callum was pacing now, his jacket draped over the bed rail. He looked annoyed, checking his watch. Is the dosage ready, Marcus? He said, tapping ash from a cigar. I don't want him lingering. Voss was at the counter, his back to Callum, working methodically with a series of glass vials. Potassium chloride is efficient, he replied. His voice is flat as a heart rate monitor. It will present as cardiac arrest triggered by acute situational stress. We have already scrubbed the fake accident report from the dispatch system. There will be no paper trail. Hearing them discuss the chemistry of my death, like they were reviewing a lab report, stripped away every remaining piece of fatherly denial I had left. Potassium chloride. A chemical stop sign for the heart. My heart. Callum raised his glass. To the old man, he said, may he finally be useful for something. The $5.2 million will get me the life I actually deserve. I'll sign the certificate myself. Voss added, natural causes. Pre-existing hypertension. It is completely clean. Then Callum reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. He flipped it open. The overhead light caught the fire of the diamond inside. It was Eleanor's engagement ring. The one piece of her I had kept hidden in the floor safe, whose door I had noticed ajar on the way out of my apartment. He handed it to Voss like it was loose change, a down payment for the evening's work. I felt Danny's nails dig into my arm from behind me, an anchor, keeping me from making a sound that would have ended both of our lives. Then Callum tilted his head. He looked directly up at the vent. His eyes locked on the grate with a cold, slow deliberateness that sent ice through every vein in my body. I froze. My lungs burned as I held my breath, wondering whether he could see the shadow of the father he had already traded for a first-class ticket to a new life. We scrambled backward through that shaft on our knees, moving as fast as we dared without making noise, until we reached the utility room and dropped to the floor. We had perhaps 15 minutes before they realized something had changed. Danny used a stolen supervisor's access card to get us into the chief of surgery's executive suite. The room was heavy with the smell of expensive wood and old cigar smoke. I sat at the desk and found the password written on a sticky note beneath the keyboard corner. Arrogance, I muttered, is always the best back door into a secure system. I entered the password, and the screen populated. And what I found on that computer was not just evidence of what they planned to do to me that night. It was a ledger of bodies stretching back years. A folder labeled Future Harvest contained the names of 12 individuals, each with net worth estimates, insurance policy details, and a status column. Pending meant they were being actively monitored for a window of opportunity. Completed meant the operation was finished and the payment had been collected. I scrolled to the completed column. Danny's intake of breath beside me was sharp and ragged. Her father's name was there. Status completed. Payment transferred to an offshore account. The referral initials beside his name belonged to a former hospital board member, proving the route extended far beyond one operating room. I watched Danny's legs buckle. I caught her before she hit the floor, the sharp smell of old mahogany and stale air filling my lungs as I held her upright. I knew it. She sobbed, the sound swallowed by her own dry throat. I always knew he didn't just stop breathing. I held her for a moment. 2 people in a stolen office, in the middle of the night, both discovering that the systems designed to protect them had been weaponized against them for years. Then I found Callum's initials beside another name that made me feel physically ill. An older gentleman named Arthur Fielding, a retired pharmacist from the north of the city. A man who had likely sat in a living room somewhere holding insurance paperwork, while a charming young man told him it was just for peace of mind. My son was not a man who had made one desperate mistake. My son was a franchise. I copied everything to the USB drive I had carried in my coat pocket out of a habit. So old, I had forgotten why I started doing it. Then Danny hissed from the doorway. Someone in the corridor. We moved now. I yanked the drive free, and we slipped into the maintenance stairwell as the office door began to open behind us. 2 floors down in the parking structure, a gray sedan was waiting in the shadow of a support pillar, its engine off, its driver already watching the elevator bank with the focused stillness of someone who had been waiting for a long time. Detective Carla Reyes was in her late 30s, sharp-eyed, wearing a charcoal blazer that seemed to absorb the dim orange light of the garage around her. Danny had called her from the break room while I was drinking the stale coffee. She didn't waste words on pleasantries. Her gaze went straight to the USB drive in my hand. Audrey told me you had something. She said, let's see it. I handed over the drive and felt the physical weight of the past few hours begin to transfer from my shoulders to the hood of her car as she opened her laptop on the cold metal of the trunk. I watched her face as she scrolled. The professional detachment began to fracture almost immediately. I had been building a case against Voss for 3 years. She said quietly, 8 deaths. Her voice dropped even lower. This drive is a confession. I needed to close the net. Can you stop them? I asked. They plan to begin at 9 tomorrow morning. She looked up from the screen. Her jaw was set. Not tomorrow, she replied. Tonight. Ha ha ha, no. Not laughing. I am completely unable to breathe. Because that USB drive, those 12 names, those initials next to Arthur Fielding's name, that is not just a crime. That is a machinery. Comment below right now. What were you feeling when Danny's father's name appeared on that screen? Stay with me because the arrest scene is coming, and I promise you, it is everything you have been waiting for. Detective Reyes coordinated her plainclothes team through encrypted earpieces while we rode the service elevator back to the 5th floor. We moved through the flickering corridor with the synchronized quiet of people who understood that any noise carried, any shadow visible through the wrong window would bring the whole thing apart. Danny led the way, her eyes burning with that particular clarity that comes when years of quiet grief finally find a direction. We reached the observation perch above room 512 and looked down through the grate one last time. Below us, Voss was preparing the vials with the methodical precision of a man who had done this many times before. Callum was on his phone, his posture relaxed, his voice casual. He was checking hotel availability in Zurich. Serena had begun packing her bag. They were scheduling my death between dinner reservations. Detective Reyes activated a directional microphone aimed at the glass. The pickup fed to the earpieces and filled the narrow space above the ceiling with the muffled, terrible clarity of men finalizing a murder. And then Callum said something that made every hair on my body stand up. He mentioned my neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Clara Webb, who lived 2 doors from my apartment, who had brought me soup after Eleanor's funeral, who had always treated Callum like a second grandson. He told Voss she had seen too much, that she asked too many questions. Voss nodded. An elderly woman with a pre-existing cardiac condition. A routine house call covers everything. No one questions it. I pressed my forehead against the cold metal of the shaft floor and felt something close behind my eyes, like a door being shut permanently. This was not a man who had been pushed into darkness by debt and desperation. This was a man who had simply never stopped. Detective Reyes' fingers curled around her radio. Her nod was the only signal needed. The heavy double doors of room 512 did not open. They exploded inward under the weight of 3 tactical officers. The flashbang filled the room with white light and the sound of splintered wood. The smell of it drifted up through the grate and into the shaft where I lay, tasting of powder and the end of something very long. Police. Detective Carla Reyes with warrants for your arrest. Drop the vials. Hands where I can see them. I watched Voss stumble backward. The syringe he had been holding fell from his fingers and shattered on the floor into 1,000 small diamonds of glass. He was slammed against the wall, his face a mask of outraged disbelief. I am the chief of surgery, he shouted. This is a complete mistake. The tactical boots that pinned him to the wall did not appear to care. Serena collapsed sideways into a chair, sobbing in the high-pitched, jagged way of someone realizing that the flight they had been mentally packing for was never going to take off. And Callum stood frozen in the center of the floor. I dropped from the service duct and stepped through the doorway of room 512. The moment Callum saw me, every last trace of color drained from his face. He looked at me the way you look at something that should be impossible. A ghost wearing the face of a man who was supposed to be sedated and dead by morning. Dad, he stammered, you're supposed to be in the waiting room. I'm exactly where I need to be, Callum, I said. I am at the end of your script. For a moment he was very still. Then he lunged. He broke free from the officer stepping to intercept him with the clumsy, frantic strength of a man running on pure corner desperation. He screamed something that carried all the entitlement and rot of every year he had spent treating people as financial instruments. He stumbled backward toward the heavy metal server rack bolted to the wall of the suite, the same rack he had intended to use to monitor my heart stopping. His heel caught on a medical cable snaking across the floor. He went down backward with terrifying velocity. The sound was the kind that a father should never hear. A dry, Sickening crack of bone meeting reinforced steel. Callum struck the edge of the rack with the back of his neck and crumpled to the floor in a heap. The room fell completely silent. Then, from the floor, in a voice thinner and smaller than anything I had ever heard come from him, he said, "Dad, I cannot feel my hands." "Do not move him," I said immediately. "Danny, get collar." Danny Walsh was already there, her face a mask of clinical detachment as she checked his pulse and secured his cervical spine. He had faked a broken spine to arrange my murder. Now the spine was real. The paralysis was real. And the man who built an elaborate theater of a dying son to lure his father to his death was lying on the floor of a room with a plan that had come apart at every single seam. Weeping, I stood over him, and I felt nothing that I expected to feel. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel relief. I felt the enormous, hollow weight of a father who had spent 37 years trying to hold something together that had never been the shape he believed it was. Outside the hospital, the storm had finally broken. Weeping still, that crack, that I cannot feel my hands. I have had to pause telling this story many times at this point, because there's grief in it that does not resolve cleanly the way we want it to. Comment below, what were you feeling when he hit the rack? And stay with me, because what comes out in the investigation afterward, what they found in his apartment, what they found in my coffee cups, it is worse than anything that happened in that room. 5 days after the arrest, Detective Reyes sat across from me in a police headquarters briefing room and slid a laboratory report across the cold metal table. "It was not just a surgical sedative they found in your blood work. Edmund," she said, "the lab flagged something much older." She pointed to a series of chemical markers. "Your system is saturated with arsenic, chronic low-dose exposure, consistently administered over at least 3 months. The concentration is calibrated specifically to mimic the early onset of cognitive decline." The room seemed to tilt. I looked at the report. Then I looked at my hands. She told me to look at my nails. I held them under the fluorescent light and saw for the first time the faint white horizontal bands stretching across the nail beds. "Those are called Mies lines," she said, "forensic markers of arsenic exposure. Each band represents a period of poisoning." I stared at them, the fatigue of recent months, the tingling in my feet that I had attributed to circulation problems, the slight fogginess that I had privately been worrying was the beginning of something neurological. I had been to my GP about it twice. He had said it was stress. It was not stress. I thought back to Tuesday mornings. Callum arriving with a bag of what he called premium organic coffee beans, insisting on making the coffee himself, telling me to rest while he moved around my kitchen. He called it his duty to look after me. I whispered. She nodded. "He has been poisoning you for months to create the medical foundation for the guardianship petition he filed with the court last week." She produced a second document, a court application in which Callum claimed I was suffering from rapid onset cognitive decline and paranoid delusions, fabricated witness statements from neighbors who had supposedly seen me wandering confused in my dressing gown, a request of the court to appoint him as my legal health care guardian, giving him the authority to make all medical decisions on my behalf, including life-ending ones. He did not just want me dead, I said slowly. He wanted me declared incompetent first, double the control, half the scrutiny. The guardianship petition had a pre-filled psychiatric evaluation attached, already bearing a diagnosis of advanced dementia, dated 2 weeks in the future, ready to be backdated and signed once I was gone. They had already written my obituary of sanity. "We executed a search warrant on Callum's flat," Reyes said. "In the back of his wardrobe, behind a box of old university books, we found the arsenic compound. He stored it in the room where you used to tuck him in as a child." I sat with that for a long time. Then Reyes opened a second folder. "There is something else," she said, and her voice dropped in a way that told me whatever came next would be worse than everything before it. She turned the laptop toward me. On the screen was a photograph of Dr. Voss standing next to Eleanor at a hospital charity dinner. They looked comfortable with each other, a familiarity in their body language that I had never known existed. Voss gave a confession to the prosecutors yesterday morning. She said carefully, "In exchange for leniency on the charges against him, he has given us everything." She pressed play on an audio file. I will not repeat everything I heard in that briefing room, but the central truth of it was this. 3 years before the night at the hospital, Callum had approached Voss at a private dinner with a financial problem. Eleanor was a guardian of family trust worth £1.2 million. Callum needed access to it immediately to cover the collapsing development deal that eventually buried him. Eleanor had refused to release the funds. She suspected where the money would go, and she had said no. And so Callum had arranged a solution. During what should have been a routine cardiac procedure, Voss administered a lethal dose of potassium chloride under the cover of a simulated sudden arrest. He had falsified the monitors to mimic a natural event. He knew my complete trust in the medical system would mean no autopsy was ever requested. Callum had stood at Eleanor's grave and wept on my shoulder. He had read a tribute at her funeral that made the entire congregation cry. He had held my arm while they lowered her casket, and he had paid £80,000 for every second of it. Weeping. I am weeping. I need you to understand what it means to sit in a gray police briefing room and hear those words and feel the entire architecture of 3 years of grief reorient itself around a truth so terrible you can physically feel it landing in your body. She was taken, I whispered to the empty room, not by illness, not by her heart, by the boy she made me promise to protect. Tell me in the comments. And if you've dealt with something similar, share your story. You are not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. The trial began 6 months later. The courthouse steps were slick with October rain. Media cameras flashed like artillery as I navigated crowd. I moved through the metal detectors into the stone corridors where the smell of old paper and floor polish offered the particular comfort of systems that still work the way they are supposed to. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B opened with a groan. And for the first time since that rainy Tuesday night, I was breathing the same air as my son. He was wheeled in on a gurney, his neck stabilized by a rigid plastic brace, an orange prison-issue garment replacing the charcoal suit he had been so comfortable in. The arrogance was gone. In its place was a visible, shivering smallness that made his frame look like it had collapsed inward on itself. I am Edmund Harlow. I whispered as the judge called the court to order. And I am here to witness the end of a lie. The prosecution laid out the physical evidence with the methodical precision of people who had spent months preparing for exactly this room. The arsenic compound, the forged signatures, the Mies lines on my nails, photographed and enlarged for the jury. The recorded conversations pulled from the ventilation shaft by Detective Reyes is directional microphone. The ledger of 12 names on Voss's computer. The cremation pre-booking Callum had placed for my remains scheduled for the morning after my surgery, ensuring no toxicology report could ever expose the potassium chloride. He had not just planned my murder. He had arranged to turn me to ash immediately to erase the evidence. When I took the witness stand, the polish or the railing was the only solid thing in the room. I recounted everything. The drive through the storm, the alcove, the forged signature, the ventilation shaft, the toast, and those words, I cannot feel my hands. Did you believe your son loved you, Mr. Harlow? The prosecutor asked. I believed in a boy who never existed. I replied. I gave him everything I had. He only ever wanted the one thing I had left to give. 3 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Attempted murder. First-degree murder of Eleanor Harlow. Conspiracy. Fraud. Forgery. Grand larceny. Consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Callum wailed. It was thin and stripped and entirely without dignity. The sound of a man who had spent years scripting his performances, discovering that the audience had finally stopped believing him. Voss stood beside him, a statue of professional ruin, his eyes as flat and empty as the files he had kept on 12 names. As the bailiffs wheeled Callum out, the gurney paused for a fraction of a second near my seat. Our eyes met. I did not see a monster. I did not see a mastermind. I saw a broken man who had traded his soul for a ledger that came up empty. He was my blood. But we were strangers, separated by arsenic and insurance forms and the body of a woman who had deserved so much better from both of us. I stood up and walked toward the exit. Detective Reyes and Danny Marsh were waiting in the hallway. I shook their hands, knowing the debt I owed them existed in a currency that no words could cover. "It is over," Edmund, Reyes said softly. "Justice is a cold comfort when you're the last one left at the table," I replied. "But it is better than the alternative." I stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the rain hissing against the stone, washing the city clean. I stood there for a moment, letting it hit my face. 3 years of grief rewritten, a son who never was, a wife who had not been taken by her heart, a man who had survived his own carefully planned execution. The hardest part of surviving, I realized as I stood on those wet courthouse steps, is not the surviving itself. It is figuring out what you do with the life you fought so hard to keep. I knew the answer. 2 months after the trial, the Walsh-Harlow Foundation filed its first grant applications, a fund designed by Danny Marsh and myself to provide legal and financial protection for elderly people being targeted through the very systems meant to protect them: insurance fraud, fabricated guardianship petitions, predatory medical arrangements. Danny became the hospital's first chief of ethics, her name on a glass office door, in gold lettering, on a floor that had once been a hunting ground. They are calling the new patient protection protocol the Harlow Standard. She told me when I visited her in that office for the last time before I left Cleveland. No dark wards, no unverified transfer authorizations, no lone surgeon with unchecked sign-off authority on end-of-life procedures. "You look right in that chair, Danny." I told her, "Keep them honest," she said. I changed my name. Quietly, legally, without drama. The paperwork took 3 weeks and cost me £40. The name Harlow died with Callum's crimes. I had no desire to carry it any further. I visited Eleanor's grave before I left. The October air smelled of damp earth and the late lilies she had always loved. I sat on the grass beside the stone and opened a sealed envelope I had found tucked behind a photograph in a drawer I had not opened in 3 years. It was in Eleanor's handwriting, written in the weeks before she died, before she was taken. "I hope you always choose yourself, Edmund," she had written. "You are always the anchor, not the chain." Taped to the back of the letter was a key, not to a bank account, to a safety deposit box containing the original deed to our family home, the one Callum had supposedly sold. With that deed, the fraudulent sale could be challenged. The ground we had built our lives on could be reclaimed. I held the key and sat with her for a long time. Then I drove to the airport. The terminal was a sea of anonymous faces. People with no idea who I was, where I had been, what I had survived. Just a 68-year-old man with a carry-on bag and a new name and a future that, for the first time in years, belonged entirely to him. I settled into my seat and looked out at the clouds as the engines began to build. I reached into my pocket and touched the small key. It was not a reminder of what I had lost. It was a tool that had finally unlocked what I had left. The engineer in me had spent 40 years designing systems to keep people safe at 30,000 feet. Now I had built one on the ground. And as the plane lifted and Cleveland disappeared beneath the cloud, I thought about Danny in her glass-walled office, and Detective Reyes closing the last file in a case she had carried for 3 years, and 12 names in a spreadsheet who had never had anyone stand up for them. And I thought about Eleanor, the anchor, not the chain. I closed my eyes. For the first time in 3 years, the silence did not feel like absence. It felt like mine. The end.